Imagine a future where the most dangerous war on Earth isn't fought with armies colliding head-on, but with warnings, ultimatums, and calculated pauses. A future where the words World War III are spoken not as a prediction, but as a bargaining chip. Picture a press conference where a single sentence sends shockwaves through capitals. From Kyiv to Moscow, from Brussels to Beijing. This war, Donald Trump warns, is already the opening act of World War III. And if we don't stop it now, history will never forgive us. That warning, stark and unsettling, becomes the foundation of a bold and controversial proposal, turning the Donbas into a neutral zone. Not conquered, not liberated, but frozen in place, like a fault line deliberately sealed to stop the earthquake everyone fears is coming next. To understand how such a proposal could even exist, you have to understand the logic of brinkmanship. The idea that the best way to prevent catastrophe is to bring the world close enough to the edge that everyone steps back at the last second. In the years leading up to 2025 and 2026, this logic began to dominate Washington's internal debates. The war in Ukraine had long ceased to be viewed as a regional conflict. It was no longer just about borders, sovereignty, or even Russia versus Ukraine. In the language of American strategists, it had become something far more ominous, a slow-motion global war unfolding in pieces. The White House narrative shifted accordingly. Officials began describing the conflict not as a proxy war, but as a distributed battlefield. NATO weapons flowed into Ukraine. Russian forces adapted, escalated, and absorbed losses. North Korean artillery shells appeared on the front lines. Iranian drones buzzed over trenches. Western intelligence officers quietly coordinated targeting. No single moment marked the transformation. Instead, it crept forward, step by step, until policymakers could no longer deny what they were seeing. This was not peace, and it was not total war either. It was something in between, and that made it far more dangerous. The phrase nuclear flashpoint started appearing in briefings and leaks. At first, it sounded like rhetoric designed to scare Congress into approving another aid package. But behind closed doors, the fear was real. Every new weapons system raised the stakes. Every escalation carried the risk of miscalculation. A missile hitting the wrong target. A radar glitch misread as an attack. A decision made in minutes that could not be undone. The longer the war dragged on, the more chances there were for something to go catastrophically wrong. Trump's warning played directly into this anxiety. Unlike traditional diplomatic language, it was blunt, even theatrical. He didn't talk about rules-based order or strategic stability. He talked about annihilation, about cities erased in minutes, about leaders being remembered as the ones who let it happen. Supporters saw this as clarity. Critics called it reckless fear-mongering. But either way, it reframed the debate. Suddenly, the question was no longer how Ukraine could win or how Russia could be contained. The question became how to stop the war without triggering the very disaster everyone claimed to be trying to prevent. This is where the idea of escalation to de-escalate entered the conversation. A concept borrowed from Cold War thinking and Russian military doctrine. It rests on a paradox. Sometimes, the argument goes, the only way to reduce violence is to threaten even greater violence. By convincing all sides that the next step will be unbearable, you force them to accept compromise now. Trump's camp embraced this logic wholeheartedly. According to this view, endless incremental aid was the worst possible strategy. It kept the war alive without resolving it. It bled resources. It normalized danger. Instead, the proposal was simple in its brutality and the stalemate, one way or another. Either force a ceasefire through overwhelming pressure, or walk away and let reality impose its own terms. The neutral zone in Donbas was presented as the middle path, a geographic buffer, a political compromise neither side would love, but both might accept if the alternative was far worse. But there was another layer to this strategy, one that had nothing to do with Ukraine or Russia directly. It was about America itself. By 2025, the domestic mood in the United States had shifted sharply. Years of foreign entanglements had left voters exhausted. Inflation, infrastructure decay, and border security dominated headlines. The old language of global leadership no longer resonated the way it once had. America First realism returned, not as a slogan, but as a governing philosophy. In this framework, the war in Eastern Europe was increasingly seen as a distraction from more pressing challenges. The Indo-Pacific loomed large. China's military modernization accelerated. Taiwan remained a potential flashpoint. Naval exercises grew more aggressive. Every missile, every dollar sent to Ukraine was one not available for the Pacific theater. Strategists worried that the United States was preparing for yesterday's conflict while tomorrow's crisis gathered momentum. At the same time, the southern U.S. border became a political and logistical flashpoint. Resources were finite. Military readiness had limits. The idea that America could indefinitely fund a grinding war thousands of miles away while addressing domestic and strategic priorities began to feel unrealistic to a growing segment of the population. Trump's message tapped into this sentiment with ruthless efficiency. Why, he asked, should American taxpayers bankroll a war with no clear endgame while threats closer to home remained unresolved? This wasn't isolationism in the old sense. It was transactional realism. Support would be given, but only if it produced results. Endless commitment without resolution was no longer acceptable. And so, the pressure mounted to force an outcome. The ultimatum emerged from this convergence of fear and fatigue. Behind the scenes, diplomats delivered messages to both Kyiv and Moscow. Publicly, the language was measured. Privately, it was anything but. The message was clear. The current trajectory would not continue indefinitely. A ceasefire had to be reached. Negotiations had to begin, or the United States would fundamentally change its role. For Ukraine, the pressure was agonizing. Accepting a neutral zone in Donbas meant freezing the conflict on unfavorable terms. It meant conceding that full territorial restoration might not be achievable, at least not now. It risked domestic backlash and political instability. But the alternative, according to the ultimatum, was equally stark. Either accept negotiations now, or face a future where American support became conditional, unpredictable, or overwhelming in ways that could provoke even greater retaliation. For Russia, the calculus was different, but no less complex. Moscow had invested enormous blood and treasure in the war. A neutral zone could be framed as a victory, proof that NATO expansion had been halted and that Russia's security concerns had been acknowledged. But it also meant giving up on maximalist goals. It meant accepting limits imposed not by battlefield success, but by geopolitical pressure. The most unsettling part of the ultimatum was its dual nature. It wasn't just a threat to withdraw aid. It was also a threat to escalate dramatically. The message hinted that if negotiations failed, the United States might unleash a surge of advanced weaponry designed to force a decisive conclusion. Not slow drip feeds, but overwhelming capability. Systems that could tip the balance quickly and decisively. The implication was chilling. Choose compromise now, or gamble on an endgame that could spiral beyond anyone's control. This approach shocked traditional diplomats. For decades, American strategy had been about managing conflicts, not forcing resolutions. The idea of deliberately pushing a war toward conclusion, even at the risk of escalation, felt dangerously unorthodox. Yet supporters argued that the alternative was worse. A frozen war without resolution was not stability. It was a permanent crisis waiting to explode. The neutral zone concept itself was carefully framed. It wasn't annexation. It wasn't surrender. It was demilitarization under international oversight, a buffer designed to separate forces and reduce the chances of accidental clashes. In theory, it would buy time. Time for diplomacy. Time for rebuilding. Time to prevent the conflict from dragging the world closer to catastrophe. But theory and reality rarely align perfectly. Critics warn that neutral zones have a history of becoming flashpoints rather than solutions. That demilitarized areas invite covert operations, proxy forces, and constant tension. That freezing the conflict might simply postpone the next war rather than prevent it. Still, the fear of World War III hung over every discussion. It shaped language. It shaped policy. It shaped public perception. Trump's warning, whether sincere or strategic, forced a reckoning. It made explicit what many had only hinted at, that the war in Ukraine was not isolated, that it was connected to a wider struggle over power, influence, and the future of global order. And so, the world watched as the ultimatum took shape, as diplomats scrambled, as analysts argued, as citizens wondered whether this was statesmanship or brinkmanship taken too far. The Donbas, once an industrial heartland, had become the symbolic center of a global gamble, a place where the promise of de-escalation was inseparable from the threat of escalation. But this was only the beginning, because once such an ultimatum is issued, it cannot be taken back. The clock starts ticking. Every move becomes magnified. Every decision carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. And what happens next would determine not just the fate of a region, but the trajectory of global power in a century already defined by crisis. What followed would test whether warnings of World War III could truly prevent it, or whether invoking the apocalypse was itself the most dangerous move of all. The idea of a neutral zone in Donbas immediately conjured visions of a cordon, a scar across the land meant to separate violence from the lives of civilians. In the Trump administration's proposal, the strip of demilitarized territory was not symbolic, it was precise. Officials described it as a 30 to 50-mile wide buffer running along the 800-mile front line that had become Europe's most entrenched battlefield. Every kilometer was meant to be free from heavy weaponry, artillery, and active military personnel. Tanks, missile batteries, and infantry units would have to retreat beyond the designated limits, creating a zone in which the normal rules of engagement no longer applied. A corridor where the logic of war was suspended, if only temporarily. The geography of the zone mattered not only for military calculations, but for its political implications. A buffer of this width would carve a line through contested territories, separating communities that had been interwoven by decades of conflict. Cities, towns, and villages within the demilitarized zone would no longer be directly controlled by either Kyiv or Moscow-backed forces, creating a vacuum of authority that would be both necessary and perilous. Highways, rail lines, and critical infrastructure crossing the corridor would require neutral management, raising questions about who would maintain access and protect civilians from residual violence. Mapping the zone required satellite data, historical front lines, and real-time monitoring, an intricate balancing act intended to enforce the illusion of peace. In a landscape still shaped by decades of conflict, the question of policing the zone introduced perhaps the most contentious element of the proposal. According to the administration, American troops would not enter the territory. Instead, the United States envisioned a European-led peacekeeping force, composed of nations that were neither NATO frontline members, nor deeply invested in the current hostilities. The emphasis was on neutrality in both perception and practice. These forces would be responsible for monitoring troop movements, inspecting weapons depots, and ensuring that neither side violated the zone's restrictions. Observers, patrols, and checkpoints would operate continuously, a human barrier between the belligerents that mirrored the technological surveillance feeding back into command centers in Brussels and Geneva. The reliance on non-NATO European nations was designed to minimize escalation. By keeping American boots off the ground, the administration sought to reduce the risk of direct confrontation while maintaining strategic leverage. At the same time, the framework suggested the possibility of a revitalized UN mission, one in which international legitimacy and legal authority would provide cover for operational oversight. However, the proposal was intentionally vague about rules of engagement, leaving the peacekeepers with a difficult mandate: enforce demilitarization in a war-torn zone without becoming a target themselves. The history of UN missions in other conflict zones, Congo, Lebanon, and the Balkans, offered a cautionary tale, emphasizing the fragility of neutrality when faced with actors willing to ignore international law. The technical specifics of the zone extended beyond mere geography and staffing. Heavy weapons were prohibited, but light arms carried by self-defense forces were implicitly tolerated. The administration suggested that monitoring would include aerial surveillance, drones, and satellite imagery to track movement, while ground forces would focus on inspections and reporting. Enforcement was expected to be transparent and continuous. A combination of technology and diplomacy meant to deter violations before they could escalate. Yet the very act of drawing the line created legal and political dilemmas, as it implicitly recognized the permanence of a front line that had previously been considered temporary or contested. Comparisons to the Korean demilitarized zone quickly emerged in policy discussions and media analyses. Like the 38th parallel, the Donbas neutral corridor would freeze active combat without resolving the underlying disputes. It would stop the immediate killing, but it would not settle claims of sovereignty or the legal status of occupied territories. Cities such as Donetsk and Luhansk would remain under the control of local authorities or Moscow-backed administrations, their futures suspended in a state of strategic ambiguity. This approach allowed both sides to step back from continuous escalation, but it also created a new kind of uncertainty. The neutral zone would become a liminal space, legally murky yet physically enforced, a place where normal rules of war were rewritten by agreement or, at least, by tacit acceptance. The practical implementation of such a zone posed enormous challenges. Commanders on both sides would need to withdraw forces in a coordinated fashion to avoid accidental skirmishes. Supply lines would have to be rerouted, and the risk of opportunistic attacks would remain high. Civilians caught within the corridor faced uncertain protections, dependent on the diligence of international monitors and the cooperation of armed groups. The proposal assumed a level of compliance that had often proven elusive in other theaters of conflict. Yet the argument from Washington was clear: without a neutral zone, the risk of uncontrolled escalation and, by extension, the very flashpoint of a broader war would remain. The political dimension was equally significant. By establishing a neutral corridor, the United States aimed to create a zone where diplomacy could operate more effectively. Negotiations would no longer be conducted at the end of a gun barrel, but in a space where both sides had agreed to step back. The strip of land was designed as a pressure valve, absorbing tension while allowing international actors to mediate. Yet, as with any artificial construct, its stability depended on the credibility of enforcement. A neutral zone that could not be policed would quickly dissolve into chaos, undermining the very objective it was meant to achieve. Strategic ambiguity was, in fact, a key feature, not a flaw. The zone did not resolve territorial claims, it postponed them. KYV could not formally reclaim control of certain areas, and Moscow-backed forces were prevented from expanding influence, effectively locking the front line in place. In this sense, the neutral zone was both a pause and a statement, a recognition that the war could no longer proceed as it had, yet an acknowledgement that its final outcome remained unsettled. This ambiguity offered leverage, as both sides would be compelled to negotiate with the understanding that the corridor represented a tangible, enforceable buffer that could shift the political calculus. Observers quickly noted that the success of the proposal depended on both perception and enforcement. The neutral zone needed to be recognized as legitimate by local populations, a delicate task in a region where loyalties had been fractured by decades of conflict. It required careful messaging, community engagement, and visible peacekeeping presence. Without the support or at least acquiescence of civilians, the corridor risked becoming a contested space rather than a protective one. Every checkpoint, patrol, and inspection became a signal not just to the warring parties, but to those living between them that stability was possible, but fragile. Technically, the zone would rely on a combination of terrain analysis, satellite imagery, and real-time reporting to maintain compliance. The administration proposed a layered monitoring system in which local observers, unmanned aerial vehicles, and international verification teams would intersect to detect violations quickly. Each side would be able to submit reports of suspected breaches, while neutral authorities would adjudicate and respond. The intent was to create transparency, reduce misperceptions, and prevent small incidents from spiraling into large-scale clashes. Yet the complexity of the task highlighted the difficulty of implementing even the most well-intentioned demilitarized buffer in a modern, highly armed, and politically charged environment. The overarching objective was clear: freeze the conflict without formal resolution. In the Trump administration's framing, the neutral zone functioned like an adjustable safety mechanism, a way to hold the line between escalation and negotiation. It was not peace in the traditional sense, but it was a structural tool intended to prevent the war from consuming resources, provoking alliances, or spiraling into a broader confrontation. The Donbas corridor became, in essence, a tactical instrument in the broader effort to manage risk while preserving strategic options. By anchoring the proposal in familiar precedents like the Korean DMZ, the administration could communicate both intent and feasibility. The comparison suggested that decades-long stalemates could coexist with enforced separation, provided that monitoring, diplomacy, and mutual interest aligned. Yet even as officials drew on this historical analogy, they acknowledged the differences. The Donbas region was more densely populated, politically complex, and geographically intertwined with critical infrastructure. The challenges of enforcement, therefore, were magnified, and the zone would require constant attention, adaptive strategies, and international cooperation. Ultimately, the neutral zone represented more than a strip of territory. It symbolized a calculated attempt to manage escalation, redefine the limits of conflict, and create space for negotiation without conceding strategic interests. By pausing military activity while leaving sovereignty unresolved, the administration aimed to force both sides into a situation where diplomacy was not optional, but necessary. It was a design built on geography, psychology, and international law, all interwoven into a single, high-stakes experiment intended to prevent the slow-motion march toward a wider war from becoming irreversible. The proposal to turn Donbas into a neutral zone immediately drew sharp reactions in Kyiv. Ukrainian officials framed it as an existential challenge, not just a policy disagreement. To them, the idea of a demilitarized strip cutting through their sovereign territory felt like a reward for aggression rather than a step toward peace. From the Ukrainian perspective, every mile of land ceded or effectively paused was a compromise of the 1991 borders, the same borders that had defined their independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Government spokespeople argued that such a neutral zone would freeze Russian gains, cementing control over occupied areas without holding Moscow accountable for its incursions. The optics were disastrous for Kyiv. A neutral zone might stabilize the front line, but it risked legitimizing the very advances Ukrainian forces had spent years trying to reclaim. In response, the administration offered what it called security guarantees, an arrangement designed to mollify Ukraine without fully committing to NATO membership. The proposed framework closely resembled the so-called Israel model, where a nation receives access to advanced weapons, intelligence sharing, and defensive technology without the mutual defense obligations that come with formal alliance status. Kyiv would be armed with cutting-edge anti-air systems, long-range artillery, and cyber defense networks, ostensibly giving it the ability to deter further Russian aggression. Yet, these guarantees were inherently limited. They depended on external delivery and political will rather than a binding military alliance. Ukrainian leaders expressed skepticism, noting that advanced armaments could buy time, but they could not substitute for the legal and diplomatic recognition that full NATO membership provides. In essence, Ukraine faced a choice: accept de facto limitations on sovereignty in exchange for immediate security enhancements, or reject the proposal and risk continued escalation on its soil. Across Europe, NATO faced its own internal reckoning. Frontline states like Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia voiced alarm, warning that a neutral zone would not contain Russian ambitions, but rather grant Moscow a reprieve to rearm and plan future incursions. Polish diplomats argued that the proposal effectively froze the conflict in a way that favored Russian strategic depth, while Baltic leaders highlighted the danger of precedent. If a buffer could be carved in Donbas, what would stop Russia from demanding similar concessions along NATO's eastern flank? These concerns exposed fractures in transatlantic unity, revealing a divide between the United States' strategic calculus and the priorities of those countries most directly exposed to Russian military power. NATO's consensus-based decision-making structure meant that disagreements could slow response times, complicating any coordinated approach to enforcement or deterrence. The United States, for its part, positioned the proposal as a tool to avoid a broader conflagration. Officials described it as a mechanism to prevent the escalation of a localized war into a global one, emphasizing the need to redirect military resources towards strategic theaters like the Indo-Pacific. Yet this forward-looking focus came at a cost. European partners perceived the plan as prioritizing American interests over collective security. Tensions surfaced not just in capitals, but within NATO command structures, where the chain of authority and operational responsibilities would need to be redefined. Some military analysts warn that partial disengagement by the U.S., even in name only, could embolden Moscow, which might interpret the neutral zone as tacit approval of current territorial gains. Strategically, the neutral zone created what some analysts began calling the gray zone in Eastern Europe. The term captured both its physical and legal ambiguity, a space where military activity is restricted, yet political and economic control remains contested. Unlike a traditional ceasefire, this arrangement would not produce a treaty or formal end to hostilities. Instead, it would freeze the conflict in place. The implications extended beyond Ukraine, signaling to other regional actors that disputes could be managed through enforced ambiguity, rather than negotiated resolution. International observers drew historical parallels to 19th century realpolitik, where great powers delineated spheres of influence to maintain balance, often at the expense of smaller states' autonomy. In this light, the proposal was not merely a tactical maneuver, but a reflection of a broader strategic worldview, one in which global stability could justify temporary compromises of national sovereignty. The geopolitical ramifications extended to Moscow as well. Russian officials publicly embraced the concept of a neutral zone, interpreting it as an acknowledgement of their operational gains, while avoiding the formal recognition of annexation. By freezing the conflict, Russia could consolidate control over key urban centers and infrastructure without engaging in constant frontline combat, preserving military strength for future contingencies. The arrangement also allowed Moscow to focus on domestic stabilization and economic resilience, calculating that time was as valuable a resource as weaponry. Analysts in both Europe and the United States noted that, while the neutral zone might reduce immediate bloodshed, It simultaneously created opportunities for strategic recalibration on both sides. For WWIII, the challenge was acute. Accepting the neutral zone risked entrenching Russian influence and undermining the broader international norm against territorial conquest. Rejecting it carried the danger of continued frontline escalation, with civilians trapped in contested areas and casualties mounting. Ukrainian leadership faced a dilemma: act to preserve sovereignty in principle, while risking human costs on the ground, or compromise on principle to prevent immediate destruction. The balance between moral authority, operational capability, and diplomatic leverage became the defining tension of the moment. The proposal also prompted reassessment among global actors. European powers were forced to evaluate their commitments and the viability of a neutral zone. In practical terms, military planners debated whether such a buffer could realistically be monitored without extensive deployment and what rules of engagement would govern peacekeepers. Diplomatic strategists considered the long-term implications for Ukraine's status in international law, questioning whether neutrality would eventually evolve into de facto partition, or if it could serve as a bridge to lasting negotiation. The debate underscored the difficulty of translating high-level strategic proposals into sustainable operational plans on the ground. Economically, the plan had reverberations as well. Stabilizing the Donbas front through a neutral zone could reduce immediate disruption to trade and energy corridors, but uncertainty over territorial control complicated investment and reconstruction. Companies and governments faced a delicate calculus. Operating in contested areas meant exposure to geopolitical risk, while abstaining risked ceding influence to Moscow-backed authorities. The neutral zone, therefore, was not only a military and political instrument, but an economic variable, influencing decisions from infrastructure repair to long-term development projects. By framing the proposal as a deterrent against the escalation of World War III, the administration sought to position the United States as a mediator capable of shaping outcomes without direct involvement on the ground. This approach relied on the credibility of both threat and promise, the ability to surge advanced weaponry or withdraw aid to influence negotiation dynamics, coupled with the offer of a neutral buffer to prevent further violence. Yet observers recognized the inherent tension in this strategy. Maintaining influence without direct engagement required trust from both allies and adversaries, and any miscalculation could rapidly erode confidence in American intentions. The final dimension was symbolic. Establishing a neutral zone would signal a willingness to manage conflict pragmatically, but it also highlighted the limitations of global governance in enforcing sovereignty. Historical parallels, such as the Yalta Conference of 1945, illustrated the risks of great power negotiations determining the fate of smaller nations. In this case, the neutral zone could be interpreted as a modern iteration of such diplomacy, powerful actors intervening to regulate conflict while leaving fundamental questions of legitimacy unresolved. The symbolism carried weight, shaping perceptions among domestic constituencies, allies, and adversaries alike, and influencing the broader narrative of international order in Eastern Europe. Ultimately, the proposal forced a reckoning over the future of NATO unity and Ukraine's sovereignty. WWII's resistance, frontline states' apprehension, Moscow's strategic calculations, and global diplomatic pressures converged on a single question: could a neutral zone prevent the slow-motion escalation of conflict into a broader war, or would it institutionalize ambiguity in a way that merely delayed the next confrontation? The answers were neither simple nor immediate. The neutral zone was a high-stakes experiment in modern geopolitics, an attempt to balance military necessity, alliance cohesion, and the preservation of international norms. Its success or failure would reverberate across Europe and beyond, shaping the strategic landscape for years to come. As discussions continued, analysts weighed the implications for the broader global order. If implemented, the neutral zone would demonstrate that powerful states could impose pragmatic solutions without full resolution, echoing centuries of realpolitik where diplomacy and coercion intersected. Yet the enduring uncertainty left open the possibility that the gray zone of Eastern Europe could become a permanent fixture, a space where sovereignty was frozen, military activity limited, and the ultimate outcomes deferred indefinitely. In this context, the Trump administration's bold proposal was not just a tactical maneuver in a regional conflict. It was a statement about the evolving architecture of global power, the challenges of alliance management, and the complex calculus of preventing the next world war in an era defined by nuclear capabilities and strategic ambiguity.